Welcome to WMB Business. I'm Steve Dorfman here with Tony Marciante. Well, today's topic is one that I'm super excited about. This is the world I live in. We're talking about customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, and specifically how those two things drive profitability. And we're here today with Richard Owen. Richard is the author of the book, Answering the Ultimate Question, How Net Promoter Can Transform Your Business. Richard, welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve.
So, Richard, as the CEO of Satmetrix and the author of this book, Answering the Ultimate Question, help us first build a little bit of a foundation so that people understand when we talk about the ultimate question and when we talk about Net Promoter, what are we talking about?
So, well, first of all, Net Promoter Score is a measurement of customer loyalty, and it's based on an answer to one simple question, which is, would you recommend this product or service to a friend or colleague? And then we measure that on a score of 0 to 10. And it turns out that 9s and 10s are what we call promoters. They're people who will go out and they will advocate on behalf of your brand or your product. 7s and 8s are passives, people who are indifferent to your product or service. And then 0s to 6s, pretty broad range, are people we call detractors. And they're actually negative to your brand or service. Now, what's interesting is that based on about 15 years of data, we know that the percentage difference between the promoters on one hand and the detractors on the other, the net promoter score, correlates very strongly to growth across a whole range of geographies and industries. So companies that have very high net promoter scores grow faster than companies that have low net promoter scores. And so it's a very valuable business tool because if you want to know about your prospects for growth, look at your net promoter score.
Okay, very good. And so it has me wonder what has been, before Net Promoter Score, what was really so broken about the way we were surveying customers?
Well, before Net Promoter Score, it's not how we were surveying different companies. The problem was we were measuring the wrong thing. And it wasn't necessarily the wrong thing because of ignorance. It was the wrong thing because things have evolved. So if you go back in time a little bit, you think about the United States economy after the Second World War, there was an era of industrial manufacturing, but there was a great deal of simplicity in the products, and people were trying to find ways to make products work pretty well. You know, if you bought a refrigerator for your home, did it work? Did it keep your food cold? And so in that era, the whole notion of customer satisfaction came about, and we asked customers, are you satisfied with your product or service? And generally, we got sort of medium types of scores mostly. And so manufacturers had a chance to improve basic satisfaction. But as you got into the 70s and the 80s, everyone got pretty good at manufacturing. People got pretty good at delivering basic services. So the notion of a satisfied customer just became obsolete. Mm-hmm. And we discovered as recently as the 1990s that satisfied customers had a nasty habit of defecting. They would leave. So if I said, you know, I'm satisfied with this product, it doesn't mean that tomorrow I won't go off somewhere else. So in other words, Steve, a much higher bar needed to be established for the hyper-competitive era we live in now. And that's when Net Promoter came in. So it's a natural evolution from earlier standards.
Very good. So looking at this evolution of the way that we survey customers and the way that we've responded to the results of these surveys, and then looking more recently at our recent economy, is it safe and fair to say that we've seen a correction in business? And what I mean by that is we've seen a lot of businesses that have, for lack of a better term, they've just gone belly up. We've seen other businesses that have not only done well in our recent economy, some have even thrived. So when I say has there been a correction, what I mean to say is, have the companies that have always known the importance of customer service and customer satisfaction, has that now paid off for them through a bad economy?
That's a great question, Steve. So in fact, I think what has happened is several factors over the last, say, 12 to 13 years, as we've seen the competitive environment in a more recessionary environment, going back to the end of the sort of booming 90s, so take hold of the economy and shape the way in which companies compete. First of all, in a tough economy, customers tend to spend more money on the brands that they have the highest level of loyalty to. So there's been a bit of a separation of winners and losers created by this very competitive environment brought on by a slowdown of overall global demand. And so there's a tendency to separate winners and losers that way. We've also seen a couple of other, let's face it, game-shifting aspects to this. The first one being the growth of the internet. And so it's hard to imagine that only 20 years ago, it was very hard for customers to share their perspective on a product or service, whereas today, it's very, very easy. So let's take a good example, a hospitality business. TripAdvisor is now arguably the most important site when it comes to people getting an opinion as to a hotel that they're going to stay at. And people are very vocal in sharing their viewpoints on TripAdvisor. So if you had a great experience at the hotel, you go out there and you really push it. If you had a very negative experience, you go out there and you post that. And people might even respond to that. And so word of mouth has become much more dramatically impactful over the space of the last 10 years in the context of social media. So tougher economy, dramatically higher word of mouth impact. And yes, that tends to create circumstances where certain businesses really do thrive. The most dramatic examples being companies that are founded and built almost entirely on word of mouth. And so if you think about the Amazons, .coms, and the Starbucks, and the Zapposes, and the Rackspaces, you've got a whole series of companies that haven't grown necessarily because of traditional mechanisms for demand generation, but have grown almost entirely through viral word-of-mouth effects because of the environment we've seen emerge over the last 15 years. So it's undoubtedly gotten both more interesting and more attractive for companies to have higher net promoter scores.
So you bring up word of mouth, and so that's a perfect segue for our next question here. I think many of us have heard this statistic. You can first of all tell us how true it is that when somebody has a bad experience, they tell 11 people, and then it actually goes further because those 11 tell 5. So maybe you can help us, first of all, understand if that's accurate, and then secondly, we know that word of mouth is effective, and we know that it's sort of evolved now with social media and Web 2.0. How can we be really intentional about creating a really effective and positive word of mouth?
So as it relates to the number of people that you pass on bad and positive customer experience to, my data's a little old. If you go back 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was unquestionably true that people tended to pass on word of mouth to multiples of individuals. And it was certainly true that we tended to pass on to more people a negative word of mouth experience than a positive word of mouth experience. I suggest, and I think it's a reasonable claim, those statistics have been turned on their head in the space of the last 3 or 4 years because of social media. And at this point, I don't think we do have good statistics in terms of the number of people that are being shared. But it could be quite dramatic, Steve. And more interesting, there's this concept of influence that's shaping the social media world. And influence was a very simple idea 10, 15 years ago for most companies. Influence was about how much a customer spent with you. If they spend a lot of money with you, then they were influential in your business. Now you have this notion of influence, and it's been popularized by metrics like clout. Whether or not clout's a good metric or not is by the by, where influence really does shape how people spread out their tentacles on the social web, and they spread out that multiple of positive and negative commentary. So I suspect we're seeing an explosion in the number of people that get touched by positive and negative word of mouth by promoters and detractors. Now, there is one statistic we do have, which is that over the last 5 or 6 years, we know that people's propensity to pass on word of mouth, in other words, their willingness to pass on word of mouth, has increased almost every year it's been studied. And we know that people's bias towards listening to word of mouth over other forms of communication like advertising has increased every year for the study of the last decade. So people are more inclined to listen, people are more inclined to talk, and the medium means that people are talking a whole lot more. That's a recipe for major growth of word of mouth.
Excellent. In the book, you also talk, Richard, about customer intimacy. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, customer intimacy is really a strategy that companies adopt where they aim to really achieve, I think, differential growth results through an explicit strategy focused on how do they become extremely connected with their customers. And what companies are doing is they're really trying to find ways to differentiate themselves on level of service. In Net Promoter Score terms, they're trying to basically find a way to create a real gap between themselves and their competitors in terms of Net Promoter Score. And that involves not a popular buzz phrase we all have in the industry, which is a customer-centric culture, which is an easy thing to say and quite challenging to accomplish. But it's trying to create an environment where everyone in the company is pulling together in a way that is centered around the needs of the customer and in a way that the customer feels they have an almost personal connection with the brand and company. And I think when we talk about intimacy and we talk about customer-centric culture, what we're talking about is a very human and emotional connection between a company and its customers. And that's what companies are trying to do.
And so how can we go from paying lip service to this thing we call being customer-centric to actually taking action on this and doing some things that are really going to have an effect? What's the first step?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to acknowledge, as you said, that there's a lot of lip service being paid today. And I think that it's a very easy thing to say that we're going to be a customer-driven company. And if you read annual reports for a lot of large companies, it's the opening page, and it's all about the customers. And yet we know by looking at data that over the last decade, companies' Net Promoter Scores, even those of many companies who claim that they're customer-centric, haven't improved that much, which suggests that at the very least there's a disconnect between intent and action, and quite possibly there's a more profound disconnect where they're just only paying lip service to it. So to answer your question, well, what can companies do? Well, first of all, companies can start by measuring their Net Promoter Score properly and understanding it and getting a really crisp understanding of what they do in their operation to create promoters and detractors. And that may sound very simple. Measuring a Net Promoter Score is just asking a simple question, but actually there's a real methodology to it, and that's why we wrote the book, and that's why we have a company. There is a methodology to getting it right, but it's a fairly easy one to learn if you bother to take trouble to research it. Once you've got that right, you need to understand how it is that you're going to improve it. What is it that creates promoters? What is it that creates detractors? And this is important. We're in an era of saturation through email surveys. So what's vitally important for companies to grasp is when they go out and they research promoters and detractors and they ask customers, are you a detractor, are you a promoter? They do something with that data. And if it's a detractor, they try and do service recovery. They try and resolve that issue. If customers provide feedback and then nothing happens, we're actually damaging our brands and we're persuading people not to take part in the exercise. So it sounds like a trite answer, Steve, but at some level, just do something's the real answer here.
Yeah, I can see how. Yeah, as you talk about it, I can see how it's playing out and how so often, too often, we're gathering feedback, and the next logical thing is that the customer is going to look for some sort of action to be taken, and when we don't take that action, boy, it just does us more harm than not having asked for feedback in the first place. So yeah, I can see how that could be really detrimental. So we've learned through the ultimate question that our 9s and 10s, and as you shared at the beginning of the show, that our 9s and 10s are our promoters. We've heard of these people as referred to as raving fans, walking billboards, brand champions, ambassadors, all these really fun, exciting names for these folks. And we've also learned that these folks are responsible for, as it turns out, 80% of our repeat and referral business. So we've got to take a break, but when we come back, Richard, I want to ask you, does it make sense to reward those folks? You're watching We Mean Business. We'll be back in seconds.
The average text takes your eyes off the road for nearly 5 seconds. At highway speeds, that's enough time to travel the length of a football field. Stop the texts, stop the wrecks.
I'm home.
Over 1 million Americans at risk of foreclosure have been helped by making home affordable. Find out now what your options are.
I'm home where I belong.
Welcome back to We Mean Business. I'm Steve Dorfman here with Tony Marciante. And today's special guest is Richard Owen, CEO of Satmetrix and author of the book Answering the Ultimate Question, How Net Promoter Can Transform Your Business. Richard, I asked you before the break about these promoters, these 9s and 10s, these folks that are our raving fans, our walking billboards, our brand champions, and does it make sense to reward these folks?
Well, at the very least, it makes sense to retain them. And your lifeblood of your business is making sure that you retain this group of customers who, after all, contribute disproportionately to your growth and, as it turns out, disproportionately to your profits. Because this group of customers is the group that goes out and buys your best products, that buys your upsell promotions, that purchases your higher margin product, as well as telling all their friends and colleagues. So at the very least, you can't afford to lose your promoters. And, of course, the more of them you have, the more likely you are to succeed in business. So you want to be creating them. So what do you do, if anything, to specifically target retaining them? Well, oddly enough, many promoters aren't necessarily in it for themselves, which sounds like a really crazy idea. There's an element of altruism in it. They love the brand you have, and so they're doing it. They're getting personal gratification from promoting your brand. They feel better about themselves because they're introducing you to other people, and they take pride in that. You know, if you love some new product you bought, you want to go and tell your friends about it. And if they get it and they love it, you feel great about yourself. So there's this very positive, virtuous circle. What you can do to really get promoters engaged is give them an opportunity to contribute to shaping your company. Because promoters really want to be part of the story. They want to provide feedback to you. They want to join groups that help define the next product set. They want to help your customers. That's why we have free online forums. They get online and they try and find ways to help other customers. So by providing them with avenues to take advantage of their promoter status and actually just giving them some status recognition, promoters really get engaged. Let me say one other thing. You know, we're in a very timely meeting here, Steve, because Facebook went public on Friday with a lot of hoopla, and we know that promoters want to promote your brand on Facebook. They take advantage of that a lot. If you go out to promoters and say, would you like to electronically, during a survey, link through the Facebook and like this product or service, you get 10-15% of them typically do it if you execute that correctly. That's a huge number of people who want to go out and like you. And you can argue whether likes are valuable or not, but they're certainly a good thing rather than a bad thing. Yeah,
providing social proof if nothing else, right?
Absolutely.
So, Richard, this is Tony here. Speaking on social media, when we look at, you recently put out a study that said that 75% of companies don't measure the effects of social media. How do you justify that, or how do you think that affects their bottom line and their future?
Well, I think first of all, we're in the earliest days of companies measuring the voice of the customer through social media, so it's not that surprising that 75% of companies haven't yet really grabbed hold of that. I think a lot larger number of companies are looking now as to what they can do. And there's also a high incidence of social media impact in a smaller percentage of companies. So it's not true that every company today has to rush out and measure the voice of their customer on social media. But we're going to see all that change over the next 3 or 4 years, and I think that number is going to go from 25% to 75% to 80% in favor of measuring the customer through social media. I think the other thing that's happened is, and this is sort of very typical of how companies think about these media, the first thing that people think of as a business when they see social media is, let's go advertise. Let's go out there and find this as a mechanism for advertising to recruit customers. It's the second thing they think of is, well, let's actually listen to what our customers are saying. And you could say that's disappointing. That's really an inversion of what people should be doing. But it's simply realistic. It's how companies typically change their behavior over time. So last week, we saw a lot of news that illustrates this. We saw General Motors saying, well, advertising on Facebook, maybe it doesn't work for them. We saw other companies saying, well, it does work for us. you're seeing this debate shape around what's the most valuable use of these communities. At the same time, you're seeing companies become increasingly aware that they have to be able to listen to customers in this environment. You go to a hotel chain and ask a major hotel chain manager, general manager of the hotel, and say, does it matter to you that you listen to what customers say about you on TripAdvisor? Does it matter that you follow up quickly? And I'd be very surprised if anyone says, no, we don't care about that. It's a chief critical mass there. We see this happening across every industry. You just got to understand what people are saying about you on Facebook and Twitter and TripAdvisor and any relatively important forum in your industry.
Very true. And how do you think, what we've seen often interviewing people is the voice of a large company versus, Joe from company X answering those kind of questions or concerns or issues. How do you feel about how that affects the future idea of that interaction?
Well, if you're contrasting, large companies with small companies, I think that small companies have always intuitively understood that they're highly dependent on word of mouth. And ironically, social media may have a bigger impact on smaller businesses. They're very affected by services such as Yelp and TripAdvisor, et cetera, as we said. Large companies, they've just got longer adoption cycles for this, but their brands are out there and they're heavily talked about. When we look at Spark Score data now across multiple industries, which is the social measure of Net Promoter Score, what's most striking is which industries get talked about and which brands get talked about. So before we even measure the score, it's interesting to figure out where the conversations are happening. And the conversations, not surprisingly, are heavily centered around the brands that are today more technically centered, or technology centered, I should say, than brands that are less technology centered. So, if you look at a conversation going about laptops, about Android phones versus iPhones, you see a huge number of conversations going on around that with people really making the argument plus or minus for their product or service. Travel, hospitality, airlines have been another huge growth area for this amongst big brands, and they're very concentrated. Airline industry in particular, 20 major world airlines, a lot of talk about which is good or which is bad and negative customer experiences. Yeah. So we're seeing different patterns emerge from large brands and from small brands. And it's simply moving so fast that it's fair to say that whatever we're learning today is going to be out of date in a couple of years from now. Who knows? I mean, even the venues may change completely. It's simply not the case that there's this static environment here. You asked a year ago and said, what was Pinterest? And people had never heard about it. Now, today it's one of the fastest growing social media sites in the world. What's the next one? If I could predict that, then I'd be calling you to buy video from my yacht in the Caribbean, not my home in California. So
if you can even make time for us, Richard.
Yes.
Right.
So looking back at cultures of companies, like one of our favorites, like Apple, they seem to intrinsically have that kind of built-in loyal following. Was there some secret that they had, or before we had social media, even they seemed to be had such a loyal following? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I just have to say before you answer, Richard, it's like this cult thing because you see people like Tony, for example, and I've got one of these stickers somewhere, but we're both big Apple fans. And so on Tony's vehicle, there's an Apple sticker, and you see this all over the road, but you never see a PC sticker or a Dell sticker. There's this tribe, so I just had to interject that before.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Apple has achieved extraordinary status in terms of whatever you want to call it, cult status or advocate status. And I think it's changed over the years. You asked what their secret is. Well, I think when they were founded in the 80s and into the 90s, that their cult status was sort of more derived from being almost having an alternative view of the universe. An Apple badge was a symbol that you believed in the alternative to what was at the time the pressing and success story that was the personal computer. And Apple wasn't that successful a company in the 1990s. Today, how do they get to this high level of status? Well, they get there quite simply by creating huge numbers of promoters. And how did they create those promoters? Well, I think it's a combination. And people who study Apple I think, try and isolate one thing that went right or another thing that went right. Whereas I would argue that there's a unique set of circumstances that went entirely right for them. Clearly, a visionary leader was part of that, and one of the true innovators of American society in the last 150 years. But also, just superb products, and superb not just from a technical perspective, but superb from a usability perspective. A product almost engineered to create great customer experience. And then I think an absolutely superb distribution model. And I think a lot of credit needs to go to the Apple Store. That was a radical way of doing business. And certainly, I've worked a large part of my career at Dell Computer and understanding the PC industry a little bit. Retail, a very tricky thing to get right in the personal computer space, generally not considered the best way necessarily to sell computers. And Apple turned the model completely on its head and did something that's quite remarkable in terms of the in-store experience. And so I think that they earned that status through a lot of different things. But, it's not just Apple. It's a company like USAA, an insurance company. There are some real standouts in the marketplace.
Richard, I also have to wonder, is there, what is the relationship? Is there a correlation between companies that provide outstanding, remarkable, impeccable customer service and employee morale and even affecting turnover and that type of thing? What have you seen there?
Yeah, so it won't shock you guys that in fact companies that have extraordinary service experiences tend to have very high levels of employee loyalty and vice versa. Now, there's always a chicken and egg situation here, and the good news for companies that can crack this is that they get both the chicken and they get the egg. The high levels of employee loyalty positively impact customer loyalty, and vice versa. This is a positive dynamic. And look, this only makes common sense. Companies are going out there and asking for data around this, and we get a lot of people talking to us about how do we create higher levels of employee net promoter score. But a lot of it is just entirely common sense. If you think about it, who wants to get up every day, go to work, and work for a company where their customers are constantly complaining and where, importantly, they are completely unempowered to do anything about it? You're not going to be highly motivated. You're not going to be proud of the brand of the company you work for. And you're certainly not going to go off and tell all your friends to do business with that company. On the other hand, if you work for a company that has high principles, that you really believe in the product or service, and that's reflected in the way in which the customers are treated, sure, you get more loyal employees. And here's the real punchline from all that. More loyal employees cost you less. They cost you less because there's lower turnover, training and recruitment costs, and here's a dirty little secret, companies often find they don't have to pay as much. So the payroll might end up being lower for the company that has more loyal employees. It's just another way in which loyal customers, employees grow your bottom line.
Really fascinating stuff. So listen, in the 30 seconds that remains here, Richard, clearly you're a thought leader in this world that we're covering today. And so I wonder, do you have a customer service or a customer satisfaction prediction for 2013?
My prediction for 2013 is this. The gap between the leaders and the laggards in terms of net promoter score is going to grow, and the economic impact is going to grow. We're just living in a world which is stretching this out. And companies that are on top of their game here are going to realize even better benefits. Companies that aren't in the winner's circle, they're in for a lot of trouble as the global economy tightens and we see the social media continue to penetrate. It's only going to get more pronounced.
Got it. Well, I think that's good news for we like that news.
Yeah, we love it.
That's exciting news. Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us today. To learn more about Richard Owen, Satmetrix, and the book Answering the Ultimate Question, you can visit wemeanbiz.tv. For Tony Marciante and myself, Steve Dorfman, thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.